after this, the divisions weren't so much over theology, over how you're saved. They were over how the church was governed and how it actually practiced. So do you have any puzzles?
So can you say that again? So that was all about
What's God
the actual
like?
core beliefs of
what
the
is
nature of God and nature of Jesus.
And how does that affect our salvation? Because the reason that people were worked up about the nature of God was not just some abstract academic curiosity. It was actually how do we get saved?
Just take the whole thing. Just take the tray away. I've had enough.
I'll have a marshmallow. Thanks.
Quick, ask Malcolm a question now.
I don't know where all this snacks went, man.
Sorry, the early church was based
2 large
on
tummies down there.
theology.
It was
Say it again.
The divisions
in the early church were all around theological issues.
theological of how you
Theology of God's nature, really.
God's nature of how you saved. Yeah.
It was often expressed, as Graham said, it was often expressed through politics. So when there was a division, it tended to go down geographic lines, which is a political
So
division.
haven't we come full circle again now? The churches are splitting based on theological now?
They
uniting
always-
church and gay marriage and that?
They always have, but the nature of the theological issue has changed. So government and practice are still theological issues, but they're not theology proper. In other words, they're
Not the
not
nature
talking
of God.
about God himself.
Okay.
So
So
that
Malcolm's wars
That's another 1,000 years
Yep.
away.
would have been
Not there yet.
caused by
So they
the
were
differences in views.
up until where we are now, there were no wars caused, except for very small squabbles in a council.
Oh, okay.
There were no wars caused by religious differences.
I'm thinking, like
Not Christian
someone
religious
felt very
differences.
strongly in one area about one issue. Those disagreed. They said we need to wipe out those pagan heretics.
Yeah.
That's why they had the councils. They sort of then tend
They
to
had-
communicate
what
the
they-
guy that
What they did have is riots. So, for example, they had riots against the monophysites, right? So in Alexandria, which became a monophysitic because it's Egyptian, right? It was a monophysitic church. They actually rioted against the wrong sort of bishop and stuff like that. So it's sort of like Hong Kong
Got a bit
at the
silly.
moment.
Yeah, right.
A bit of a riot. Maybe not a million people marching on the street. But so, so now the church is big. We've sort of sorted out that core issue. So now we move to the more peripheral issues. They're still important though. So this is where the primary differences of denominations become government. So who is our authority and how do we hear from them? And how is the church itself governed? And practice, which is how do we worship? What are our practices in everyday life or the rest of our life? Make sense?
Yeah.
And this sort of difference goes all the way down through to today. Today, when a group disagrees about the nature of God or Jesus, they tend to go into heresy like the JWs. So they tend to leave Christianity. So most of the divisions between Christian churches are on these issues today. So here's a bit of history from AD 450,
So
which
we've
is
been
where we
talking
left
so
off.
much. We must be. How are we doing time-wise? Just
We've got half an hour. So this is faster. We've covered the hard stuff, right? The issues of God, they're the hard parts. This is just weird history. So the Roman Church, remember, this was most of what we've looked at happened in the East. It was mostly driven by Constantinople and Alexandria and the Eastern bishops and thinkers. Now the focus, certainly our focus, moves to the West. The Eastern Church was pushed out by Islam into the north and into Greece, and it didn't really, I don't know, from what I understand, the Eastern Church doesn't have a very exciting history. There wasn't a lot of dynamism in it or
It
anything
didn't
like that.
evangelise after
Yeah.
Russia. It stopped
Actually,
evangelising.
yeah. So in the 800, here, in this part here, these things, some of these, like Hungary, Bulgaria, Russia, these are the evangelism that the Eastern Church did. And once it did that, that was the end of the Eastern Church, the end of interesting stuff in the Eastern Church. Islam wiped out large parts of the Eastern Church. And eventually it came all the way into France, and we'll see what happened when we get up to that time. But Rome became the papacy, the Pope, the bishop above bishops in AD 590. They sent missionaries to Ireland and Britain and made sure that they were Roman Catholic. And they the church joined its strength to the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne was crowned in AD 800, which is an easy date to remember. But the Holy Roman Empire was basically dead by 987, and the church was pulled down with it. And this led to this period ended in the Great Schism, which is when the Eastern Church and the Western Church formally went their own way. They'd already been drifting apart, but in 1054 the Western Church excommunicated the Eastern Church.
And vice versa.
Yeah. And the things that led to that was the iconoclastic dispute, which is the issue over images. Is it okay to have images? And the Eastern Church said yes, as long as they're not statues. Paintings are okay.
So they had,
You know how the Russian Church has these icons?
yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. So the the Eastern Church, the Western Church was not iconoclastic. The Eastern Church was, but eventually they settled on just icons. That's why they focused so much on them. And the Protestants came along much later, and they were quite iconoclastic, even more so. They got rid of everything.
So I guess the worry was people are worshipping a statue rather than worshipping God.
Yeah.
That was the
Okay.
fear.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Is that like the statues of Mary and stuff all over the Roman Catholic Church?
Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church is full of images of saints and stuff.
And they
Jesus.
pray to them.
They do.
They
Some
do,
do.
that's right, yeah.
Right,
So,
thanks.
and the Protestants were very concerned with that because there was a lot of superstition around all of that stuff. So, and the same sort of argument was held back in, I think it was 800 or 700 and something AD. Then they had a disagreement about the procession of the Holy Spirit. Does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son, or just from the Father?
And that was a really big one.
It was.
Yeah.
Weird, isn't
I
it?
dated a Greek girl who was Greek Orthodox for 2.5 years, and in the front of their New King James Bible, they're very big on the history, and they emphasise that point. That's probably the biggest point.
I think they've
No.
cherry picked it, but it was just one in a series of disagreements. Then they also had a bit of argy-bargy, the Bishop of Rome versus the Patriarch of Constantinople, who's in charge. They also disagreed about the boundaries of their authority, and their cultures were drifting apart. Greek culture was quite different from Roman culture.
Worth noting probably at that stage as well, the language was changing. So in Rome
Yeah.
they were using Latin now,
Yeah.
in Greece they're still using Greek.
So when they were talking about things like the creeds, the Roman Church was talking about it in Latin. So we get consubstantial from Latin, and homoousis is the Greek. But even though those words are defined to mean the same thing, they actually have different nuances because they're real words, or they're made up of real words. And so that would confuse the debates, and it just got really complicated. And the fact that the underlying languages were Koine Greek and Hebrew and stuff just made things even more complicated. Then they also disagreed about the relationship to political authority. The Roman Church said, no, we're in charge of the secular rulers, and the Eastern Church said, no, we're okay to be, sort of subservient to some degree.
So as you were saying, at that time, we've got Rome, and then where was the centre for the Eastern Church?
Constantinople.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
still, okay.
But once Islam came along, obviously it got pushed out of
Constantinople
Constantinople
stayed the centre until about 1500, when it finally fell to Islam.
to Islam. Yep.
That's during the Crusades.
Mm.
And now it's
Oh, yeah.
Istanbul, of
Yeah.
course. And it was originally Byzantium, but
Right.
and the liturgy and of the church and the society was very different as well. They things like the iconoclastic dispute made a difference to that. So the liturgies, and they were different languages, etc., etc. So over time they just drifted apart, and eventually they got to the point where they just said, right, that's it, time for a divorce.
The weird thing is, to like a typical sort of Australian Baptist or United Church person, you couldn't tell the difference if you went to a Roman Catholic church service
Yeah.
in another language or a Greek Orthodox church service. They sort
Yeah.
of feel so similar.
Yeah, they're what we call high church,
Yeah.
right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
And even Anglican
That's a
is
good
the
point.
same,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Lutheran
Yes.
as well. Like High
That's
Lutheran
right.
is the same as
Yeah.
well.
Right.
They're all just high.
That, as in priests that bounce around in robes. And
Yeah, and they're waving smoke about and
Yeah.
doing
And it's
things.
very
They'll walk
Frankincense.
about. Yeah.
Sorry. What is the last one? Liturgy and society? What
So
is-
their liturgy, the order of the service,
Yeah.
that was different, and the society, the way that they considered the church's relationship with society to work
understand,
and stuff.
Okay, so that's up until then.
Yeah, and this is the
So that's
division.
the
This is
Greek
where it
Orthodox.
was divided between the
Yeah,
Greek
the
or
Lutheran.
between the Eastern Church, which was Greek, and eventually became Russian Orthodox and all that sort of stuff, and the Roman Church. Now, the Islam is pushing in,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
So it's just
and
gotten
over
smaller.
here too. So.
Mm.
So after the Great Schism, from AD 1054 to 1517, does anyone know what happened in 1517?
That's Martin
That's
Luther
like-
nailing those
Yeah.
things
That's
to the
right.
door in
Right.
Wittenberg.
That's right.
1066
That's
to make
often
it happen.
considered the start of the Reformation. But as you can see, there's a whole bunch of stuff that leads up to it. The Crusades was launched against Islam because the church.
Wanted Jerusalem back.
under all the
Well,
They wanted
the
their own-
Muslims were at the Rhine. They were right in the heartland of France, and the church, remember, was a political authority at this time,
Yeah.
and the church said we can't let this happen. We've got to strike back, and so they launched the Crusades. And the first 3 Crusades were merely that, like military expeditions. They got more messy afterwards. So it was a defense initially, but it became messier. But in the end, they didn't keep Jerusalem. They did conquer Jerusalem, but the Muslims took it back and kicked them out again. But nonetheless, it got Islam out of Europe. So Spain was reclaimed, and all the way back to
To Turkey.
the Bosphorus Strait,
Prosperous.
to which Istanbul sits on. Europe managed to reclaim all of that land, or the church managed to reclaim all that land, and it was Europe as well. So in 1198, in the middle of the Crusades, or towards the end of the Crusades, Pope Innocent III was the Pope at the time, and he was the most powerful Pope. He basically ruled Europe. He told all of the kings of Europe what to do. So he was the one who said,
So
you
no
need to...
separation of power of church and state at this stage.
The church was the state
Yeah.
at this
Yeah.
stage. And then around this time, the church instituted the Inquisition, which was designed to make sure that there weren't any heretics. I've got a book on the Inquisition.
Spanish
It's a lot.
Inquisition.
It's a lot more complex than what people think. And the Spanish Inquisition wasn't
It's a bit
until the
later.
1500s.
1500s, so it's
Yeah.
not till way.
The Inquisition wasn't as bad as people
No,
think
it's
it
the
was.
Spanish
The
Inquisition was really
Inquisition
bad.
was the one that
Even the
went
Spanish
through,
Inquisition wasn't as bad as people
No one
think it
British
really
was.
respects
Isles.
No one
Hey?
expects.
The Inquisition went through the British Isles. Was that the one, the witchcraft?
No,
No, that's
No,
the
no.
Salem witch
No.
trial.
That's
all of
Protestants.
that.
That's a bunch of
Yeah,
Protestants.
Protestants was just bad burning Catholics. It was terrible. This
In
time
fact, that-
period.
But was this
Most
when,
of the
No,
most
this
of
was
the
just- this
bad
was early.
things that we believe about the Inquisition is Protestant propaganda, anti-Catholic Protestant propaganda.
Because this is not a Spanish Inquisition. This is just
Yep.
Inquisition wanting
The
to keep
Inquisition,
When-
yeah.
The faith pure.
Came the
faith pure.
The
Yeah.
theology of it
Yeah.
pure, yeah.
into
Okay, so it's different to
France
carry
actually,
on.
France still has an inquisitorial justice system because they inherited that from the church
All right.
and from Rome. The church carried the Roman judicial system throughout Europe, and France still has that. England developed its own judicial system, but yeah, it's interesting. Anyway,
Okay, what's
scholasticism was an intellectual movement
Sounds
that
like it.
was the result of a revival, thanks partly to Islam, of the classics. So the
Yeah.
classics, the texts of Aristotle and Plato and so forth.
Yeah.
The Western Church had only really known about Plato for a long time, and suddenly through Islam they gained access to all of these other Greek philosophers, and they started rediscovering the richness of classical philosophy and combining that with Christianity. And so there was this great flowering of thought and philosophy and
So-
understanding, and that's when universities were born and
was the
things
Dark
like that.
Ages in
I was
the
just about
Inquisition
asking.
time?
Yeah, this is all Dark Ages from after Rome
This is-
fell
Yeah, that's
till
right.
about the Reformation. It's all the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
So this
Yeah.
whole section is.
It's actually
Yeah.
nowadays
Yeah.
people call it the medieval era.
Exactly.
I still call it the Dark Ages.
I call
Dark
it Dark
Ages,
Ages.
medieval, yeah.
Yeah, if you've seen documentaries like Dark Ages and Age of Light, you'd realise that it's not actually dark at all. It's incredible. There was huge advances in technology and art and thought and so forth in
But
Europe.
people were illiterate.
The peasants were
serfdom
illiterate.
was really-
Yes,
was
the peasants
really-
were
Yeah,
illiterate,
yeah.
not
like they
really.
still are in China or Russia. Not
Yeah.
so much Russia,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
yeah. But there was a huge middle class, and particularly towards the end of the medieval period. And in terms of religion, mysticism became very popular, and a lot of these things were, you know, how the Catholic Church has groups like the Jesuits and the Benedicts and
Yeah.
and all of these different groups within the church. There was a huge diversity within the Roman Church. Mysticism was a part of it. There were all these mystical groups within the church, and that sort of counterbalanced scholasticism so that it didn't become too academic. So they recognized that there was still this spiritual nature of things, and you couldn't understand everything. And the reason which scholasticism emphasized didn't answer everything. You still needed the spirit and the recognition of the experience of God and things like that. Monasticism had been around for a long time, and it really flourished in this era. And you've probably heard about the Irish monks, and the monasteries throughout Europe were enormous economic engines of growth and scholarly work, etc. But on the downside, there was the Babylonian captivity, which is what they call the approximately 70-year period when Avignon sort of captured the Pope in a sense. So the papacy was captured by Avignon, so it was politics. Avignon's a beautiful city, by the way. If you get the chance to go there, you should go there.
Is that France?
It's in Provence, yeah, in southern France. And then after that, just to make things worse, they had this massive papal schism where there was a really weak pope, and they tried to replace him, and they ended up with 2 popes, and they tried to solve that and ended up with 3 popes all at the same time. And it was just a huge embarrassment. So the church was just getting into more and more of a mess, right? And then the Renaissance made it even worse. The Renaissance, which sort of grew out of scholasticism, the arts really rediscovered the classics, and there was this flourishing of humanism, this focus on humanity and the beauty of humanity and all this sort of stuff, which
Ignoring God.
and the church was reacting to that.
Right.
I don't know if you're going to go on to the next slide, but this is also the time that this idea of purgatory was being developed, where
Right.
after you died, before going to heaven, you spent time in purgatory to suffer for your venial sins. Sins were split into two groups: mortal sins which needed to be forgiven for you to go to heaven, and venial sins which didn't, but you could be forgiven through punishment after you died in purgatory. And so people then would
You could buy an
buy
indulgence
indulgences from the Pope,
to get out of purgatory quickly.
and that would get you less time in
And that's where
purgatory.
corruption of the Pope came in.
Yeah, and some of that
Yeah.
money went towards the Crusades.
It's like
and other
those
things.
Monopoly cards
So all
that
this was
get
developing
out
at the
of
same
jail
time. The
card.
church was getting a bit weird,
Get out of a
or
purgatory
really
card.
weird, I guess.
Purgatory actually, purgatory was invented back around 350 or something by Cyril or somebody like that.
Oh, really?
But it was really developed at this stage.
It's only in the Roman Church. It's not in the Eastern churches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
A bit silly. Why
No
did
questions.
monasteries? I knew that they did a lot of farming and whatnot,
Mm.
but why were they breweries?
The monks like their beer and wine.
But also, well, it was a form of hospitality. That's the monasteries were also a place for travellers to
Yeah.
seek refuge
And
in
for
Yeah.
storms
the
and
poor. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So-
they would then have.
With beer.
Well, brewing is a
Brewing was a way of preserving too.
Yeah.
It was better
So
than
it was
drinking the dirty well
fermentation. I
water.
get
Yeah.
that. I get
Yeah.
that.
and it's a great way to preserve the grains, etc.
We've got the Black
The
Death
calories
here
of the
too, haven't
grains.
we?
Yeah.
It's been
It
happening.
used to be
Yeah.
much healthier,
The Black Death, yeah. There were lots of other things that I haven't mentioned in here.
of course.
And focusing on the Reformation, leading up to the Reformation, just as leading up to the Great Schism, there was a whole bunch of causes. The same thing happened with the Reformation. So it wasn't just suddenly Martin Luther hammered a bunch of theses on the door to the Wittenberg Cathedral. There were lots of precursors to this, starting with John Waldo, who started the Waldenses, which were a very Protestant-like group. He read the Bible and he said, "Hey, Jesus told us we should, go out in twos with a staff and no bread and all this sort of stuff and witness to people." So he started this movement that really tried to obey Jesus' teachings in the Gospels. And the Catholic Church expelled him because they weren't priests, they couldn't do that sort of thing. But that didn't stop them. That movement continued, and eventually it merged with the Calvinist movement after the Reformation. John Wycliffe, an Englishman, he translated the Bible into English, a common tongue. He was the first English Bible translator, and his was the first English Bible, and in fact the Tyndale Bible was influenced by him, and the Tyndale Bible formed the foundation of the King James Bible. So, and the King James Bible has been incredibly influential on most Bibles since then. So Wycliffe, which is why the ministry of Wycliffe is named after him, because he's an incredibly influential.
But the English in 1377 would not necessarily be an easy text.
No. So Tyndale did quite a lot of updates to bring it into Middle English. This was early Middle English, I think, 1377. And Tyndale actually believed that Scripture was the sole authority, not the Church's teaching.
Yeah.
So that was
just
probably radical too. wasn't it?
yeah,
So that's interesting. Yeah.
and that Christ was the head of the Church, not the
Right,
Pope,
right.
and a whole bunch of other sort of Protestant beliefs. He'd already figured that out just by working through translating the Bible. And John Hus was a Czech reformer. He came out of the Czech there was sort of reform movement happening in the Czech. It wasn't a republic back then. And John Hus was one of the great figures that came out of that, and he too believed that Christ was the head of the church, and that the church should only be made up of the elect,
Oh, yeah.
not everyone.
No.
So remember, the Roman Catholic Church, everyone in a Roman Catholic country was a member of the church. Whereas Hus said, no, only people who actually are Christians should be part of the church. Then a guy called Savonarola.
Never heard of him.
No, he was martyred. He was a reformer in Florence, and he preached a lot of the same sort of ideas as general Protestantism, and he was executed for heresy by the church. And so Italy isn't a particularly Protestant nation.
At the same time, there's
The Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc.
She was a little bit before this, wasn't she?
Yeah,
Where did she
I
live?
think so. She was like 1200s or something, wasn't she? Was she part of the Crusades? Was she around the era of the Crusades?
Yeah,
I
something.
think she's a bit later.
I can't
That's
remember.
Look it up.
She's not a Protestant. She's not part of the Reformation.
That's
Put it that way.
Look it up, Steve.
Yeah.
Steve's looking it up in the
And then there was this group called the Brethren of Common Life, and this was a pietistic movement way before the Protestant pietistic movement. This was a very, very early pietistic movement. And they had house churches, they shared property, and they thought that...
She's born in 1412.
Okay. So she was around John
Till
Huss's
31.
time. Yeah. There was a lot of fermenting. The society was really
Nice.
unsettled. Europe was just this seething cauldron of
Yeah, she died
discontent
I was
and...
going to say, how old was she when she died?
19.
She
Yeah,
was
she was
basically
young.
like a military ruler.
Yeah, she
Yes,
was.
she was.
Yeah, you know, like so.
So there were just so many movements happening in Europe at this time, and there was so much intellectual discontent, so much social discontent. There were all these little tiny fiefdoms, these little city states and stuff, and they were all squabbling with one another, and the church was sort of losing control over them.
But this is
And-
over a 200 year period.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's over the
That's the
centuries
longest Australia
leading
been
up.
held. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a long period of time. And then in 1517, Martin Luther finally got a bee in his bonnet, mostly about indulgences. And he posted his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Probably glued them rather than hammered them, apparently. Yeah, that's what they say. They say they didn't actually hammer things; they'd glue them, like
So that's the
just
whole
like they do
decision.
nowadays. Party at
Postage.
go and see so and so at such and such a bar.
Postage, yeah.
Luther's got a concert on tomorrow night. And he was excommunicated in 1521, and that Prince Frederick of Saxony, basically said, "Okay, we'll start a church in Saxony, which is part of Germany, one of the Germanic cities." And so Lutheranism started, and over the period, over the next 100 or so years, there was all sorts of political turmoil and religious turmoil,
So
and
where
out
is
of that,
Where is the Anabaptist from?
They were from the Netherlands and
Yeah.
from sort of Switzerland area.
Yeah.
And they're probably really similar to theology of most modern day Baptists, even though they're not directly linked.
no,
And they were particularly pacifist is one of their,
Yeah.
one of their key
Yeah.
features.
Yeah.
one of the key things is they believed in separation of church and state, and they were fairly pacifistic. They were because of separation of church and state, the church had significant control over who came into the church and all that. So baptism was important, but a lot of Anabaptists were infant baptizers and also baptism by sprinkling, so they didn't really care about immersion. And some Anabaptists were what we would call heretics. So it was a very diverse movement. That's why there's an S at the end of it, because there's lots of different types of Anabaptists.
Okay.
And they basically died out. which is why Baptists actually
Down
come
here,
from
so we're
somewhere
not
else.
really-
Yeah.
Okay.
There are still some Anabaptists around.
Yeah, I think
They're in Canada and North America.
exactly.
Oh,
So the Anabaptists
yeah, like
have
Mennonites or
continued-
something.
Yes,
Yeah.
I've been to an Anabaptist church.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
So the Mennonites and
Yeah.
the Amish were
That's
the
right.
Anabaptist
Yeah.
movement too.
So they're a bit sort of
That's
Fruit
right.
Loopy.
Well, they weren't Fruit Loopy. They weren't Fruit Loopy at the time, perhaps.
We might
I say they're very gentle.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
very
are.
gentle, peaceful
Yeah.
people.
They are.
Yeah.
Very beautiful.
Okay, so we're basically kind of, you've got the Lutherans there, then you've got the Calvinists.
So Baptists didn't inherit that gentleness because they come from English.
Yeah.
So directly out of the Reformation we had Lutheranism, which really spread, and it's actually, Lutheranism was the major Protestant religion for a long time, particularly in the north, and it became the state religion of Germany and Sweden and Norway, obviously, which is part of Sweden at the time, and Denmark, and not Holland, though Holland was Calvinist. And then Calvinism was a major competitor, and Calvinism started in Zwingli sort of merged into, Zwingli was before Calvin, but he was similar theology, and he started in Zurich, and Calvin really developed, he built on top of Zwingli's thought and developed a very sophisticated theology, and it was a very evangelical religion, partly because that's just what Switzerland was like. It actually went into France, the Huguenots, which they are here over the left, but they mostly got killed out by the French. And it also went across the Channel to Scotland and the Presbyterians. And also it really went into the reaction against the Anglican Church, which is a direct Reformation church, an embarrassing one. But the Puritans and the Separatists were reacting against Anglicanism, and when Calvinism came across from some exiles that had come back to England, they picked up Calvinist sort of belief to a significant extent, and the Baptists came out of that movement at the end of Elizabeth I's reign. The Baptists were a part of that sort of Puritan and separatist movement, and that's how they moved across into America. Anglicanism, you know the story, it was, Henry VIII's way to get out, to do what he wanted to do wife-wise, or not really wife-wise. So that's why I say it's a bit embarrassing. But the interesting thing about Anglicanism is that it started with a very ignominious sort of beginning, but Anglicanism developed some extraordinary theology, like the Westminster Confession and stuff like that.
I think the people behind it, outside of Henry VIII, were really...
It was seized upon
Good
by
Christian,
really
yeah.
strong thinking
Yeah.
Christians
Yeah.
who said, well, we'll use any excuse to
break away
fix
from
the
the Church
church.
of Rome.
Yeah. And so Anglicanism grew into something much more than its beginning. So you know what these churches believe, right?
Yeah,
That may have to
I would
wait
think
till
so.
another day, hey?
Yeah.
But it would be fair to say that we probably get our roots from a bunch of those churches, don't we?
Yes.
We
that-
get our roots from the Presbyterians, the Puritans, the Anabaptists, the Anglicans, the Calvinists,
even the
Lutherans.
Congregationalists, I think.
All of them.
And Anglicanism as well, in terms
For
of
sure.
reaction
a lot of
to it.
Anglicanism roots and influence.
Yeah, so Baptists are a fairly young church, but the next century, so that's all 15th and 16th centuries, 16th and 16th century really, and then 17th and 18th century, there was a rise in mysticism again, in
Yes.
Protestantism, and the Quakers came out of that,
Yeah.
as well as some other people that you've never heard of and aren't interested in.
Maybe we are.
Well, Jainism. Have you heard of Jainism?
I have actually.
But Jainism, the Indian religion.
Yeah. Well, there's a Christian one too. And then there was a wave of biblical revivalism, and that expressed itself in two forms. One was Arminianism, which which was stamped out as a denomination but was very influential as a theology. And it fed into, for example, Methodism. And then Pietism, which was, we talked about at the beginning, which was this idea that our faith should have an impact. And that was a reaction to the fact that the Lutheran and the Lutheran and Calvinist churches had become very theologically oriented but cold. They didn't live out a Christian life.
Was this sort of when a charity movement started, or not quite yet?
You're getting there.
Almost.
You're definitely getting
The Methodists did a lot of that sort of stuff. Yeah. And then in the 19th century,
That's when
so the Moravians,
Exactly.
the Moravians were the European Pietists, and they influenced the Methodists, who came out of the Anglican Church and spread to America and throughout the world. I don't have the 19th century because that's when things like the Salvation Army and stuff started up, and they were in response to the Industrial Revolution and the inequities and stuff that happened there.
the alcoholism.
Yep, alcohol and all that sort of stuff. And they came out of the Methodist Church because they had that sort of concern, that social justice concern.
And you haven't even, have you got that next one? Pentecostalism.
Yeah, where are we? The last
okay.
century. So in the last century, what are the movements been in the last century? Well, these are all parallel movements that have all happened in the last century. This is probably a bit abstract for you guys, but so Pentecostalism
Hasn't been
was.
abstract up until now.
What is UCA?
No, I mean everything
thing.
so far.
What is UCA?
United Church of Australia.
Yeah,
Oh,
Uniting
okay.
Church in Australia.
Okay.
So Pentecostalism started at the turn of the 20th century, and there were things that led up to it, but it really kicked off at the beginning of the 20th century. And in Australia, it's led to movements like AOG, which is now ACC, or COC, which is now INC.
Oh, it's
Yep.
inside the
Hillsong.
Australian.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't bothered putting other stuff.
So it's Assembly of God and Church of Christ, is that right?
No, Church of
Church of God, COG, isn't it?
Christian Outreach Centre,
Okay.
Christian Outreach.
which is now INC, which is what Elevation is.
Right.
Yeah.
So Pentecostalism didn't just create its own denominations, it also influenced other denominations dramatically. All of them, including Catholicism itself.
Yeah.
So Pentecostalism was really more of a movement than a denomination spawning thing.
Yeah.
It did both, I
But it's
guess.
fair to say it initially came out of American
Yeah,
Protestant churches.
it's an American
Yeah.
American movement that spread around the world. And Canada had a big input into it with the Toronto Blessing and stuff. And fundamentalism, another American movement, morphed into evangelicalism, which has been a big influence on denominations throughout the world.
And that's Billy Graham.
Billy Graham is one of the prime movers in evangelicalism. Now, a movement in the 19th century from Germany, higher criticism, led to the liberalisation of mainstream denominations in the 20th century, which is what we were talking about before. And higher criticism basically questioned the truth of the content of the Bible and the truth of its authorship. So it said lower criticism questions what the Bible actually says, and that's textual criticism. So it tries to figure out what the original text said. Higher criticism questions who wrote the texts and what their agenda was.
Yes.
And once you start doing that, that leads to all sorts of weird
Leads to loss of
ideas.
faith.
Yeah.
That's what happened to my mum.
Then there was another movement at the same time called ecumenicalism, which was trying to reverse this what we've been talking about, all of these splinters and stuff. And ecumenicalism is saying the church should come back together. And the Uniting Church in Australia is a classic example of ecumenicalism, and what a stupid idea it is if it's forced on people. speaking, I think I can speak authoritatively as somebody who grew up in the Uniting Church.
It's just not the same.
Well, because it often leads to liberalism. Because if you say
That's right.
compromise
I was
on
gonna say.
this,
Yep, that's
Yeah.
right.
we'll compromise on this, and that's all good until you say, well, okay, we'll compromise on actually believing the Bible,
Yeah.
and that's the problem, isn't it?
One of the key things with the Uniting Church is that the Methodists were Arminian and the Presbyterians were Calvinists. So they had different views on the relationship between man and God in terms of our will and how we, even to the point of how we are saved in a way. Arminians believe that we choose, and that's the primary movement in salvation. We choose, and God's grace, which pre-exists our choice, then is activated by our choice. Whereas Calvinists say God chooses, and we only choose because God has chosen. And when you put those two together, you can't. Right? You can't put them together. So what the Uniting Church said was, we're not going to talk about this. It doesn't matter.
Depends on youth group leader.
But the problem is that it does matter, and if you don't talk about it, you end up slowly rotting away and not talking about things that really matter, or not caring about things that really matter. And so the Uniting Church has become very open to anything.
So to sum up
It's like the
everything
United
about
Church
denominations,
of
it's complicated.
Yeah, I can't believe you've managed to go through 2,000 years of church
I know.
history in less than 2 hours.
You've done well.
That's great.
And then
That's
the last
it.
one is the missionary. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. And international missions matured. And so what we're seeing today is this incredible growth of the church in the rest of the world, in Asia and in Africa. And so that's
And a
taken
decline of the church.
centuries.
In the West.
It's growing
Yeah.
faster there than it's declining.
Well,
in the
the
West.
interesting
Yes.
thing is the Christian
Some parts.
church is it's the fastest growing religion in the world, big religion in the world. You wouldn't know it in Australia, would you, or America?
Or
Europe.
Or Europe.
Europe,
Yeah.
sure,
Yeah.
I would have thought
Yeah.
Islam was a strong.
So the way that I would sum this up, Luke, is that what matters to us is that we have differences and we have similarities, right? And those differences are our government and theology and our practice and our priorities. But we do have similarities too. We have a shared theology. We have a certain amount of theology, most of it, that's shared. And we have a lot of shared practices and priorities. And so we need to be aware of the differences, but I think we can focus on the similarities. And I think if we don't try and force ourselves together, ecumenicalism can work, right? So if the Uniting Church tried to force these different denominations together, and it doesn't work.
When it'd be better for them just to stay there and pray together and
And
do
do
community
things,
together.
work together, do joint
Yeah.
missions, like do joint.
At the
like,
time it was
yeah.
happening, there was an awful lot of very small congregations,
I know.
very small Methodist. I do not understand how they got the Presbyterians involved, because the Methodists and Presbyterians were, as you said, so
Loggerheads.
apart. It was not funny.
Yeah.
But then some of them are such small congregations that they could see that they were not going to be a viable church for much longer because of declining, getting smaller and smaller, and they wouldn't, and the property and the whole thing. So they just said,
Well, let's
okay.
solve it by not having property.
Yeah, that's
So we
right.
don't have to
Not
worry
having
about
property,
all that jazz.
or decide to let's
Well,
go into this bigger church where we
The
then
Methodist
have.
was communal property,
Yeah, well, Methodist always was.
whereas the
communal.
Presbyterian, they owned their own meds, and owned their own church. And owned
But if you have no congregation to support the,
To support it,
the
that's right.
facilities, that's why a lot of them went. It was odd.
Is this in Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's just-
I was Methodist.
Mm.
Just after the uniting, within 6 or 8 months, I moved to Presbyterian and never gone back.
Yeah.
And
Well, actually,
when we moved, after we got
we
married,
did the
Wait a
Uniting
minute.
Church.
no, it was, yeah,
Uniting Church. We
Uniting
married
Church
him in
in
United, yeah, and we got married in
and we
United.
didn't go Baptist until we hit Kalanga in 84.
I had a friend who
83.
moved to the Presbyterian Church when I was in university,
Yeah.
and from the Uniting Church, and we had big arguments about
then your-
predestination
But
and
then,
stuff
yeah,
like
that's
that.
because you've got a Methodist background.
And I was like, how can you believe that rubbish?
My brothers,
So Salt.
I was a
So
teenager.
Salt's Presbyterian.
Well, that's what
Yeah,
I
that's
heard.
right.
I've heard all these arguments
With
before.
my brother's
Father-in-law.
father-in-law is a predestinationalist Presbyterian, and Gordon was brought up Methodist and has been through Baptist and he's current teaching at Lutheran schools these days. He still goes through Baptist.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's some
There's been some interesting
Christmas
conversations over the
discussions are
years.
interesting.
Yeah. And it's,
Politically so, open to discussion though,
Yeah.
which is nice.
yeah. And that's the key.
And
That's,
he was our youth
Youth group.
Yeah.
youth group leader for about 4 years.
that's something that I've learned since I was a teenager, is that you can actually talk reasonably and productively about these things. And I have a huge amount of respect
Discuss
for the
why.
Reformed position, because I've spent a lot of time learning about it and talking with people about it, and I actually have adopted parts of it rather than Wesleyan theology, because I think Reformed theology makes more sense in certain areas. But I think it's important to really be irenic, to be, to listen to people and
To be respectful of
to respect
Yeah.
people, and not just call them an idiot because they disagree with you.
Well, that never works on
Comes
any
with
level.
maturity.
No.
Yeah, it doesn't work on any level to prompt people to a point of being so
Yeah.
angry about something.